in, on altars and temples. So this is a book wrapped in front of a small shrine, and this shrine happens to be actually in a library. So there's shrines and libraries, there's libraries and shrines. There's this very interesting, there's a second PhD in here somewhere, I think. It's just fascinating, but if I ever have the energy, I'll go back and do that. But so I thought maybe it's something about the physicality of it. And then I came across something really fascinating, which was, this is Gene Smith meeting the Dalai Lama. He's the person who created these books in the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center. And most of what he's digitized has come from his personal collection. He had the largest single collection of Tibetan books outside of India. And what happened was he was very interested in getting these books back into monasteries, and they started distributing them in print. And then he thought, why not just start taking them back to monasteries on little Mac Minis, because it's a really nice portable format. Most of these monasteries had monitors and computers. So he started taking them back and distributing them. The subscriptions that universities pay for access to these resources pays for the texts to go back to monasteries who can't afford them otherwise. And there's a movie being made about Gene's life, and they've got this great clip of him going to this monastery in Kathmandu. He presents I think there's something like 12,000 texts on this little Mac Mini, and he gives it to the abbot of this huge monastery in Kathmandu, and the abbot is very excited and smiling, and the first thing he does is he takes the Mac Mini and puts it on his head, just like he would if you handed him a religious text. And he says, he says a prayer, and everybody in the room stops and prays with him. And he says this little joke about sort of, wouldn't it be funny to be doing prostrations to your computer instead of to your texts? But at the same time, he's kind of not joking, because he just held it up to his head and prayed. So it's this great moment. And then similarly, Gene gave the entire canon of Bon Tibetan Buddhism, a particular sect of Buddhism, to the abbot of Bon Monastery. And he gave it all to fit on a little memory stick. And so there it is on the memory stick, like the entire historical canon of this tradition. And the abbot carries it in a little pouch around his neck, so he always has the text close to him. So there's this fascinating thing going on here about this sort of reliance on being close to the texts and having a certain reverence for the text, but it doesn't matter what format it's in, really. The format it doesn't matter. So I thought, what is it about this that has sort of led to this? And I came up with a couple of interesting sort of factors. And the first was that in the Tibetan diaspora, the landscape itself is completely saturated with text. So you have prayer flags, which have text on them. You have what are called mani stones, which are stones with prayers carved on them or painted on them. Text is everywhere. And the second factor is that, from what I could tell, in the practice of Tibetan Buddhism, there's both a long history of reproducing text and copying text, but also an automated reproduction, which is where I think the interesting piece comes in. So to put it very simply, in order to copy a text is to bring a blessing on the person that copies it. But by copy it, there's many different ways of copying it. So to recite a text, to recite a prayer in particular, is a form of copying it. It's a sort of form of oral copying. But there's also literal copying as well. And so the Tibetans have never had any hang-ups about whether this is automated or not. So by some accounts, the very first use of movable type, you can see this is a little wood block. This is for printing prayer flags. And these are little pieces of type that slot in so you can change them. So by some accounts, the very first uses of movable type were actually Tibetan prayer wheels. This is huge. It's kind of hard to make out with that. This is the inside of a prayer wheel. I don't know if you've seen prayer wheels, but it's a cylinder that you spin, and inside of it is thousands of texts repeated on a piece of paper. And so to spin the prayer wheel, if you spin it in the right direction, you're said to be reciting those texts. So it's a way of kind of automating the recitation of those texts, or even automating the copying of those texts. And then you can take that one step further. You have giant prayer wheels filled with texts. You put them on a pole, put that into a river, and it's spinning. You don't even have to do that. You can go to the temple, have some tea, your prayers are being recited for you. You know, they've never had sort of any concern about whether this is done manually, the way we think about whether you have to write it out by hand. It just needs to be done. And Buddhist geeks, there really is a group called Buddhist geeks, have taken this one step further and filled prayer wheels with DVDs with prayers. So sort of, more bang for your buck. Each prayer wheel contains 128 DVDs for a total of over 1.8 trillion prayers. So, in extreme, but fascinating things. And so to give a very quick summary of sort of the research part of the research that I came up with, the lessons that I kind of took from this part of my research was that sometimes the best technology is the least technology. That digital technologies are great for transmission, and sometimes they're the right end product, though, and sometimes they're not. And also, and this will come up again a little bit, there's this really important relationship between the number of users of something that you want and the amount of innovation it causes in somebody's practice. So carrying around something physical on a memory stick or even on a small Mac memory, people have the same practice with regard to that as they do to paper text. And similarly, we talk about the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center, which does this sort of straightforward digitization. That project has thousands of users, well, however many people can read Tibetan, so lots of users. Because it doesn't change the kind of practice that scholars use. It's reading a text, it's still reading a text. It's just sort of changed out the physical for the digital. The Tibetan and Himalayan Digital Library, on the other hand, huge sort of transformation in practice. So not a lot of people are willing to spend the hours it takes to understand how to use this site effectively. Those who did, it really revolutionized their scholarship. Completely different sort of inputs and outputs of their scholarship, but a really high sort of overhead of having to spend a lot of time in order to use it. So I'm getting very close to my 20 minutes. I think I'm a few minutes in, so I'm going to go very quickly to the next thing. But for something completely different, to go to Africa. This is Adam. I'm not going to try and pronounce his surnames, but Adam is a Parakuyu Maasai junior elder, and that means when he's one of sort of the active governors of his tribe. And a few things sort of specifically about the Parakuyu is that they are pastoralists, which means that their land is commonly owned. And a few years ago, the government of Tanzania, they occupy a space that borders Tanzania and Kenya, and the government of Tanzania asked them to leave their land and gave them a new piece of land somewhere else. And their society is very much based on the transmission of, it's very sort of formalized structure of learning. It's based on transmission of information from generation to generation and from age group to age group. But the learning and everything they sort of know and their livelihood is based, and you can imagine when this is sort of what your surroundings are like. Their livelihood is based on knowing their land and their physical geography incredibly well and handing that down. They have no native written language, although most of them they write in Swahili when they do. Their native language is spoken only. And it's really important for them to know what can graze together because they're pastoralists, what grasses, cows eat the long grass, what eats the short grasses. This is all sort of the really important pieces of information that they need to survive. And when they moved to the new piece of land that they were given by the government, they found it wasn't good grazing land. And so as a result, a lot of the people in the village in this group have been moving into cities.